Hi there, my name is Clement Ye, and today I am going to do a lecture on the history of pictorial representation as it pertains to perspective drawing and some of the types of drawing that existed before perspective drawing was understood. And we're going to talk a little bit about 1, 2, and 3-point perspective drawing and some of the rules and terminology, as well as isometric projection, which sometimes can be confused with perspective drawing. Okay, so there's going to be some terminology, and let's start off with a few definitions. Perspective drawing is the representation of three-dimensional objects on a two-dimensional picture plane that create the illusion of depth. And we'll get into what I mean by the picture plane in just a little bit. Key concepts to creating illusionistic space are the diminishing scale of objects as they become farther from the viewer. So things that are farther away appear smaller. This seems obvious, especially when you look at the world around you, but they were not always represented in visual art. The overlapping of objects in front of each other. When something is in front of another thing relative to your position, your viewpoint in space, then things will overlap. And then you have the convergence of parallel lines as they recede towards vanishing points on the horizon. This may seem obvious today, but illusionistic depth was not always important to artists and was not always understood, so perspective drawing had to be discovered. And we're looking at a Leonardo da Vinci image from 1481, which shows that he understood the math involved in creating one-point perspective. Okay, so we have here a hieroglyph from 2055 to 1650 BCE. That stands for Before Common Era. And in this image, we have a whole bunch of humans and gods that are part of a larger narrative. And right up here and here, we have a couple characters that are situated on top of each other, which suggest that there's some overlapping and a little bit of indication of illusionistic space. We also have characters that are smaller than other characters, but the way that scholars understand how these images were constructed, the general understanding is that the smaller figures here and up here are not meant to be farther away from the viewer than the larger characters, but that they are just have less importance in the narrative, or because they are humans and not gods, so they have less value placed on them in that narrative. Therefore, they've been represented smaller, and not because they are farther away from the viewer. In this Greek vase from circa 525 BCE, you have some overlapping of forms. So the first guy and the third guy and the fifth guy are closer to the viewer than the second one and the fourth one. So you have some overlapping of forms, and there's a little bit of distortion in the anatomy here because of how the rib cage is and the muscles are put together, but you know, that's totally an aside. But definitely some overlapping of forms, which suggests that this fictional space is has a certain amount of depth to it. Okay. In this image from China, Tang Dynasty, we have again some overlapping of figures, and we have this representation of a table that appears to go backwards in space. However, all these figures are the same size relative to our viewpoint. Like if you were to measure the size of their faces and their bodies, they occupy roughly the same scale on the image, which goes against our understanding of how perspective works in if we were to take a photo of this space and these people in the back are farther away than the people in the front, then they would appear smaller, right? And you have this table here, and these diagonal edges are going back in space, but they are not converging. In fact, they are diverging, meaning that the point in the back between them appears to be wider than a point in the front. So it runs contrary to how we understand the construction of perspective in any contemporary images. And this is not to say that this is wrong. It's just another way to construct an image, and this was the convention in Asia for hundreds of years. Okay, so in this image from an unknown French artist in the 15th century, you see an increased understanding of how to depict perspective. For example, if you were to look at this wall right here, and you see how the top edge and the bottom edge converge at some vanishing point on the right hand side, but most viewers will assume that if they were standing over here and looking at that wall straight on, then the top and bottom you're going to presume are parallel to each other, and the wall is straight with 90-degree corners. But because it's tilted away from you, then the top and bottom edges visually converge at a point over to the side. You see that over on this side, and you see it over here and over there. However, this image breaks down when we analyze it a little bit further, because these workers that are on the left-hand side have bodies that are about half the size of these guys on the right. And then you're going to ask yourself, are they little people and these guys over here, are they giants? Or are we supposed to assume that these guys on the right are more important within this narrative, like in the Egyptian Book of the Dead? And so that's an example of how this image breaks down in terms of understanding it as a perspective representation. And then you have these people on the top that are tiny, and they are not that much farther back from these guys over here, or even these guys. And just the way that the perspective is mapped out in these spaces is very confusing, because they don't seem to have any relationship with each other in how they are situated. Because you have a wall over here that is behaving very, very differently than the walls around it. So there's some really, really weird distortion going on there in how that space operates. And if this is really what that space would look like, then you're just going to have walls that are set up at very strange angles that don't have 90-degree corners, or are kind of tilted at very unusual angles in relationship to each other. Okay, now we're going to jump forward to Italy, 1366, and then you have another religious image with these guys kind of piling out of this castle. There's overlapping of forms. The actual rendering of the images is quite lovely, but they all have the same relative scale to each other. Their bodies are roughly the same size, even though you understand that the ones in the front are going to be closer to you than the ones in the back, yet the ones in the back have bodies that are of the same size. So much so that when they're piling out of this door, their bodies are physically larger than they could possibly fit in this door, assuming that this is, a full-scale castle and not some kid's playpen. So there's a little bit of a breakdown and understanding of how this space operates. Okay, 1500s, Raphael. When he was 25 years old, Raphael was so accomplished that he was commissioned to paint the Pope's apartments in the Vatican, and he placed a self-portrait of himself down here in the bottom right-hand corner, second from the right, looking towards us as the viewers. And he's populated this image with various scholars and artists, mathematicians, scientists, philosophers of that time period. And they're all having this large conversation about the nature of reality and the nature of knowledge and our place in the universe. And this is a classic one-point perspective. It's a humongous fresco, and we know like the scale of it, not only from being able to visit it, but because down in the bottom left corner, these are a set of double doors, so you could safely assume that these figures are roughly around life size. How this works as an perspective drawing is that the characters in the front, as Michelangelo is right here, are physically slightly larger, visually slightly larger, not physically, than the characters that are farther in the background. Also, you have all these converging lines coming off the columns and the tiles going towards a point in the center. Like everything lines up to the center. So you have all of these lines that draw your attention to the center. And it's extremely well painted. It's a very beautiful quality of light in this. So it feels like a believable space. However, it does not. It is one-point perspective because there are some limitations in how this doesn't completely accurately present what this space would look like if you were actually standing in it. That if this was a real space that you could walk into, and you assume that you as a viewer are either standing on the floor or just slightly above it, because this, your eye level is right around here. And if you were indeed in that space, then the tops of these columns would be farther apart from you than the bottom of the columns, yet they're represented with perfectly vertical straight lines, like 90 degrees to the horizon line. But if you were standing in this space, that would not be the case. These points would be farther away from you. Therefore, these lines wouldn't actually appear 90 degrees. They would slightly tilt inwards. If you imagine, putting your head down low in a room and looking upwards, then anything that's farther up the wall is going to be smaller in scale. So, not to pick on Raphael because it is a beautiful image, but this is a good representation of how one-point perspective has some limitations. Okay, so when we're talking about a perspective, we're going to discuss a few definitions. And you can pause this video to read some of this terminology, but I'm just going to go over some of the points that are the most important. Particularly right here, we have this object that's been labeled PP, which stands for the picture plane. So if you imagine your artist is sitting here at a point called the station point, which is the point at which she is stationed and observing the world in front of them through an invisible sheet of glass, you could say, that we call the picture plane. And all of the points that the artist is observing get projected onto the picture plane, which becomes the drawing. Essentially the picture plane is the drawing, just as right now we are looking at a drawing and we're looking at objects represented on this image. So you could say that this entire rectangular frame and everything in it is are objects that are projected through this invisible sheet of glass that we call the picture plane. Okay. Right here on the top set of illustrations, you have this object that's the same distance from the viewer, but as you move the picture plane farther away from the viewer and closer to the object, then the object appears consecutively larger. So that sheet of glass that we're talking about, as it gets closer and closer to the object, then the representation of that object becomes progressively larger. So in this image, we have a viewer here, and the viewer is looking at an object that in the three images appears at different heights, and in the distance beyond everything that the viewer can see is the horizon line. So it's always present. If you were to take away all the walls, trees, buildings, and objects in front of you, beyond all of that is the horizon line, which is the end of your perceivable space on Earth. And we usually represent it as a straight line. And if the object that we're trying to represent is situated lower than where it appears on the horizon line relative to our viewpoint, then we're going to see the top of it. If somewhere in the middle of the object it is at the same visual height as the horizon line behind it, then we're not going to see the top or bottom. And then if the object is floating, then we're going to see the bottom of it, because the bottom of the object is above the horizon line, which is at our eye level. Okay, so in this image we have a couple examples of isometric projection, which is not perspective drawing, but it still has some suggestions of a three-dimensional space. In the first image, which is Q*bert, a screenshot of Q*bert, an arcade game from the 1970s, we have this stack of cubes in the Q*bert playing field, and the viewer understands generally that you have these cubes in the front at the bottom that are closer to you than the ones on the top, but the scale, the visual scale of each of these objects at the bottom in the foreground are the exact same as the ones on the top. So there's kind of this breakdown of that illusionistic space because those objects don't recede. Even if Qbert or these other, there's like snakes and these balls, they move up and down this playing field, but they are presented at the exact same size in the back as they are at the front, so they don't come forward and backward in space, if you will. Also, if you were to put a protractor against these angles, you would find that they are all perfectly parallel to each other and they don't converge in space. So that's how this does not work as a perspective drawing. And the same is true for this U-Haul illustration of a rental truck. The diagonal lines here and the ones going this way are completely parallel to each other. So it does represent this as a three-dimensional object, but it does not converge, so it does not work as a perspective drawing. That doesn't make these images wrong. It's just another style of pictorial representation, and it has advantages in that it gives the viewer an equal amount of visual information for the objects in the rear as the ones in the front. So it kind of flattens things out and makes this three-dimensional object have an equal amount of visual weight between anything that's closer to you versus anything that's farther away.